Welcome to this special edition of 7:30. One of the nation's most influential political leaders has resigned, not due to the biggest challenge of our time, COVID, but instead over a series of poor judgments that spilled from her personal life into the workplace, miring her in a corruption investigation. The New South Wales Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, today said she had no option but to stand down after her state's watchdog ICAC announced it was looking into whether there'd been a conflict of interest between her public duties and her private interests. Gladys Berejiklian has been alone among the nation's leaders in arguing consistently throughout the pandemic that Australia must live with COVID and use lockdowns as a last, not first resort, something that for most of the past 2 years has won her strong public support in her home state. Even her political opponents today described her as hard-working and a person of integrity, while her supporters called her one of the state's best premiers. But her downfall is not as unexpected as it might appear. Political insiders believed the clock was ticking the second she sensationally revealed to ICAC last year that she'd been in a secret 5-year relationship with disgraced MP Daryl Maguire. 7:30's Paul Farrell and Alex McDonald have broken several key stories in this investigation. This is how we got here.
Premier, you requested a reassessment of a $5.5 million grant that Daryl Maguire stood to gain a political benefit from.
Can you please stand back a bit? Thank you.
For almost a year, Gladys Berejiklian brushed aside questions from 7:30 about how millions of dollars in public money was spent in the electorate of former MP Daryl Maguire.
Isn't that a serious conflict of interest given you were in a secret relationship with him at the time?
Firstly, the proposition you're putting is absolutely ridiculous, and second, all proper processes were followed, and that's all I say on the matter. Thank you.
We've seen the letters that you exchanged letters with Daryl Maguire about this project. You wrote to him, you thanked him for bringing it to the government's attention. Wasn't it a serious conflict of interest getting involved in any way in that grant process, given you were in a relationship at the time?
I refer you to my previous answer, and please respect this press conference. Any other questions? Yep.
Today, the career of one of the nation's most powerful and popular figures came crashing down.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to make a public statement and won't be taking any questions.
When the state's corruption body announced it was examining Gladys Berejiklian's conduct over several years.
It pains me to announce that I have no option but to resign from the office of Premier.
To understand today's bombshell announcement, we need to go back to October last year.
There's a sensational story breaking out of the ICAC inquiry.
Please be seated, Ms Berejiklian.
The Premier made a surprise appearance at ICAC, making a public revelation about a very personal matter.
Ms Berejiklian, have you ever been in a close personal relationship with Mr Maguire?
Yeah, I would like to say at the outset that Mr Maguire was a colleague of 15 years. He was someone that I trusted, and that developed into a close personal relationship. Yeah.
Were you in love with her, or were you just with her for the power? Will you apologise to the public?
Gladys Berejiklian downplayed the significance of that relationship.
Does the Premier deserve to lose her job?
I didn't feel the relationship had sufficient substance for it to be made public.
What did Gladys Berejiklian know about your business dealings?
ICAC has been investigating whether Daryl Maguire misused his position in public office for his own financial gain. Gladys Berejiklian's revelation about their relationship raised questions about whether the Premier had ever made decisions that could benefit him politically, or if she had an undeclared conflict of interest.
You've got yourself in a terrible mess, mixing up your public duty with your private relationship that you kept secret for many, many years.
I've tried to be as open as possible, answer all the questions as fully as possible.
Last December, 7:30 revealed the Premier's role in the process of approving a grant for this development, the headquarters of the Australian Clay Target Association, when Daryl Maguire was the local member.
Here you have a somewhat smallish association in Wagga. Clearly they want to get ahead. They're very friendly with Mr Maguire. He's got influence. He backs their proposal to build a new clubhouse.
The Premier has said there was nothing unusual about how this $5.5 million grant was awarded.
I understand all those arrangements went through the normal processes. I don't intervene in those processes.
The normal process is for you as Treasurer to sign off on it.
Well, I'm telling you now that as Treasurer, you oversee all funds that are obviously going through, but that is up to the relevant minister, and I wasn't the relevant minister.
You made decisions that would benefit your boyfriend.
Wrong.
That's the truth, isn't it?
But these documents obtained by 730 revealed Daryl Maguire wrote to then Treasurer Gladys Berejiklian in January 2016, asking for financial support. She responded personally a month later, thanking Daryl Maguire for bringing the project to the government's attention. Before the Clay Target Association had even lodged a formal application, its funding was set aside in December 2016. As Treasurer, Gladys Berejiklian would ordinarily have chaired the committee making these funding decisions. A year later, she moved into the state's top job.
I think as night follows day, the Premier would have been obliged not to sit on this decision. Now, whether she did or not, I don't know. But if she did, I think that would be a clear conflict of interest.
Initially, the state government wasn't persuaded by the Clay Target Association's proposal. An internal government assessment questioned whether the plan to create a convention centre would attract significant numbers of international and interstate visitors as promised. After the development failed a cost-benefit analysis, a letter between two senior public servants reveals a request by the Premier to take another look at the project. As the grant neared final approval, another senior bureaucrat updated one of Gladys Berejiklian's staffers. Just wanted you in the loop, the staffer writes, given the Premier's interest in the Clay Target grant.
What we see from these documents is not only was the Premier advised right at the outset, she was kept in the loop and intimately involved throughout the entire process. And that's very much contrary to the Premier's public narrative.
Over the past 10 months, 730 has been documenting how this relatively obscure grant was funded. We've asked the Premier about her role, and she said that there was nothing unusual about the process. But today, the Independent Commission Against Corruption announced that it believes the Premier does have questions to answer. It's investigating the Premier's role in awarding the grant and whether that amounted to a breach of public trust.
Morning, Premier. How are you feeling?
Have I stuffed up in my personal life? Absolutely. Am I devastated by what's happened? Absolutely. Am I embarrassed? And do I accept that people will cast judgment? Of course.
The corruption watchdog will hold a public hearing on 18 October, where it's likely Gladys Berejiklian will be summoned to explain her actions.
I've always acted with the highest level of integrity. History will demonstrate that I've always executed my duties, again, with the highest level of integrity for the benefit of the people of New South Wales, who I have had the privilege to serve.
After toughing out this scandal for almost a year, on top of managing the summer bushfires and COVID, Gladys Berejiklian appeared exhausted at her resignation press conference today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to make a public statement and won't be taking any questions. I've had to make an extremely difficult decision overnight, but one which I feel obliged to do because of the love and respect I have for the people of New South Wales and the high regard which I have for the Office of Premier. I was advised late yesterday afternoon the Independent Commission Against Corruption will today release a public statement in which it will state it is investigating allegations made about me concerning matters relating to the former member for Wagga Wagga. As the leader of the New South Wales Government, I have expected the highest standards of myself and my colleagues. I have made it clear on numerous occasions that if any of my ministers were the subject of allegations being investigated by an integrity agency or law enforcement, then he or she should stand aside during the course of the investigation until their name was cleared. However, standing aside is not an option for me as the Premier of New South Wales. The people of this state need certainty as to who their leader is during the challenging times of the pandemic. My resignation as Premier could not occur at a worse time, but the timing is completely outside of my control, as the ICAC has chosen to take this action during the most challenging weeks of the most challenging times in the state's history. That is the ICAC's prerogative. Resigning at this time is against every instinct in my being and something which I do not want to do. I love my job and I love serving the community, but I have been given no option following the statement that's been issued today. Notwithstanding the challenges of the last few years and few months in particular, I have never felt stronger nor more confident in my leadership. I have absolutely no regrets during my time in public life. My only regret will be not to be able to finish the job to ensure the people of New South Wales transition to living freely with COVID. Most importantly, I want to thank you, the people of New South Wales. When the chips were down in the past few years, in particular during the drought or the bushfires and now COVID, we stood alongside each other. We've grieved and supported each other during these tragedies. I hope you know that you will remain foremost in my thoughts. Serving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Please know that every day I gave it my all and worked as hard as I could to create a better future for our state and its people. Thank you again for giving me the honour of being your Premier. Thank you very much.
Michael Yabsley is a former Federal Treasurer of the Liberal Party and a former New South Wales Minister. Michael Yabsley, given what we know about the ICAC investigation into Daryl Maguire and what's been revealed about the Premier's association with him, is it actually surprising that this is where it's ended?
No, I don't think it's surprising at all. It seems to have been a throwaway line of today that this has come as a great shock, come as a great surprise. But I think those in the know, political insiders, have been saying for a long time that as much as COVID might be a big issue for the Premier to handle, there has been a big black cloud hanging over her head for a long time. I mean, the truth of the matter is, and this is just a matter of fact, that the ICAC inquiry was unfinished business.
And what is it about the actual content of the inquiry that has made it unsurvivable for her at this time? What is it that goes to the heart of what you point out that political insiders have thought, well, this is not going to be survivable?
Well, I don't think it is unsurvivable for her. I mean, I think it was very much an option for her to step aside. I agree that there was probably no option but for her to at least step aside. But I'd have thought that would have been a good middle path for her to tread. But look, perhaps she knows things that we don't know, and she's made it clear that she saw that, in other words, resigning, as being the only option.
Well, she said that she felt that it would just be too uncertain. Nobody would know how long the inquiry would go. It's such a critical time for the state that they have to know who the leader is. You think she could have just sort of stood aside and let someone else fill in for a while?
Oh, look, I'm not pretending for a moment that it would have been straightforward or easy. And, perhaps she was also somewhat unnerved by the idea that she may have had to hand over the reins to John Barilaro for an indefinite period of time. I don't think that was probably not an option that she wanted.
What's the view among Liberals about the fairness or otherwise of what's happening to Gladys Berejiklian?
Look, as someone who was around, I was actually part of the government that established ICAC back in the late 80s. It wouldn't be overstating it to say that for those of us who were around at that time, and for those who have been part of politics, often on both sides of the fence since the late 1980s, it wouldn't be overstating it to say that ICAC is viewed as something of a monster in political circles. But ICAC is what it is. It's been set up with extraordinary powers, and if it is a monster, it's been on the loose for 30 years, often doing a good job, but at the same time, for a lot of people in political office, and not only political office, in the corporate world, in the public sector, making life something of a nightmare.
The Premier took a swipe at ICAC over the timing of this, saying it's one of the worst moments in the state's history for something like this to occur. What's your take on that?
Look, I think it'd be pretty hard to provide any guidance to ICAC about not only what they do, but when they do it. But as much as ICAC is free to make up its own mind as to what it does and when it does it, those that it affects are also entitled to have their say, and the Premier certainly made that clear.
Do the people of New South Wales need to be worried about a change in leadership at such a critical juncture in the pandemic?
Look, I think if you look back to changes in leadership are part of political life. And if you just go back in New South Wales' recent political history, Gladys Berejiklian was preceded by Mike Baird. Mike Baird was preceded by Barry O'Farrell, you keep going back. I think these things are compartmentalised and people move on. Today is a day of high political drama, but that will subside and life will return to normal, and I would suggest return to normal fairly quickly.
Michael Yabsley, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee.
Gladys Berejiklian is the third Liberal Premier in New South Wales to leave before their term ended. Jason Om takes a look back at her career.
From one of the most powerful people in Australia to the political scrap heap. A lot can change in politics.
It pains me to announce that I have no option but to resign from the office of Premier.
A self-confessed goody two-shoes, Gladys Berejiklian was born in Manly to Armenian parents.
Politics was a huge part of Gladys's life. Went straight into the Young Liberal movement, became the state president, and worked in Peter Collins' office before challenging for pre-selection.
She went on to become a Commonwealth Bank executive, but changed courses in 2003 when she ran for Parliament in the seat of Willoughby on Sydney's North Shore.
North Shore's full of them. There's Joe Hockey, John Howard, Peter Collins, Brendan Nelson. If you're a member for North Shore federally or state, you were expected to be in the cabinet. She had a great grip of economics, and I always thought she was going to be a future treasurer. I didn't envisage that she'd be premier.
Rising through the coalition's ranks, she was widely seen as a safe pair of hands during the 2010s, as a loyal minister under Barry O'Farrell and a treasurer under Mike Baird.
And I want to do what I shouldn't do, which is single out one person who through this campaign has worked tirelessly, has communicated effectively on top of her existing significant job. I want to thank Gladys Berejiklian, our campaign spokesperson.
When Mike Baird retired in 2017, she took over as his anointed successor unopposed, becoming the state's second woman premier and leading the coalition in a come-from-behind victory in the 2019 election.
I am most proud a state in which someone with a long surname and a woman can be the Premier of New South Wales.
She staked her government on the economy, pouring billions of dollars into roads and rail.
Everybody of goodwill wanted Gladys to be a success. She's a hard worker, she's Minister for Transport, she was Treasurer, so she's done the hard roads.
In the eyes of the public, Gladys Berejiklian could do no wrong, but she faced internal dissent and a tense relationship with the coalition partner, the Nationals. Then late last year came the shock revelations in the ICAC of a secret relationship with Daryl Maguire.
So did you actively limit the amount of information that you knew about Daryl Maguire's business dealings?
I've already made that very clear, and absolutely not.
The scandal raised serious questions about her political judgment, but she survived. She fended off a vote of no confidence in the Parliament, and publicly she laughed off concerns.
Don't you find that secret sex is always the best sex?
Oh, God, it didn't take long.
I love it. I get it.
But you know what, really, what it made me aware of was, if you told me a year ago this had happened to me, I would never have believed anybody. So I feel like I'm kind of watching a movie.
Unedifying departures are a common theme in New South Wales politics on both sides.
That as the Premier of this state, the public and the opposition and every member of this place deserves to know that their Premier at all times has upheld...
You haven't done that.
Leader of the Opposition? Leader of the Opposition?
And Gladys Berejiklian is not the first Premier to quit over investigations by the corruption watchdog. Former Liberal Premier Nick Greiner set up the ICAC in 1988, but resigned in the wake of a scandal. So too Barry O'Farrell in 2014, who quit over a bottle of wine he received as a gift.
The New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption came from a Hong Kong idea imported into Australia, and it started, there's ministerial codes of conduct. They have coercive powers, which means they can search warrant your phone, they can covertly surveil you if the evidence justifies that use of coercive powers. And the ICAC has invariably had to look at the conduct of ministers and ministerial discretion.
Apart from the deadly Ruby Princess outbreak, Gladys Berejiklian won praise for her handling of the pandemic.
New South Wales is the gold standard.
New South Wales is the gold standard. So I don't spend too much time worrying about New South Wales.
The New South Wales government's testing and tracing capabilities, they're gold standard not just in this country but anywhere around the world.
But by June this year, COVID was out of control, bringing tens of thousands of cases and scores of deaths across Sydney. Some question whether the Premier should have locked down earlier. New South Wales now faces more uncertainty in a time of social and economic unrest.
Thank you again for giving me the honour of being your Premier. Thank you very much.
Like her counterparts in Victoria, Western Australia and Queensland, the New South Wales Premier has become one of the most powerful figures in the nation during the past 2 years. That means her departure from the political stage has more ramifications for federal affairs than a change of state Premier normally would.
Gladys is a dear friend of mine. We've known each other for a long time. She has displayed heroic qualities as the Premier of New South Wales.
I've always worked very closely with her, and I find her to be a person of integrity and a person that works hard for her state.
I've always found Gladys to be a person of the highest integrity.
Rules are for everyone, and the Premier has made the right decision.
I have no doubt that Gladys will always conduct herself in a way that suits the integrity of the office that she's held, and I know how seriously she takes that trust.
When you put your life into your career and you work long hours, it's a distressing period for her and her family.
Today is not about any one MP. It's not about any one Premier. Today is about starting to fix the entrenched culture of pork barrelling in New South Wales politics. That's ultimately what has brought down Premier Berejiklian.
Mr Morrison refuses to apply the same set of integrity that Gladys Berejiklian applied to herself today.
Laura Tingle is 7:30's chief political correspondent. Laura, Gladys Berejiklian has been alone among the state premiers until Dan Andrews' recent conversion to argue that the nation has to live with COVID. How is her departure likely to play in the National Cabinet and in the management of the pandemic?
Well, Gladys Berejiklian has been an absolutely crucial part of the National Cabinet, Lee. Obviously the largest state, but if you think about going right back to the beginning, she and Dan Andrews were the ones who essentially forced the Prime Minister to understand the need for lockdowns. She's played a really interesting role in terms of keeping the pressure on the Prime Minister on a whole range of issues, but also in some of the interstate fracas with Queensland and with Victoria. So she's been a really substantial figure. It does change the dynamics of the National Cabinet very significantly. I think that she won't be there. Dominic Perrottet's regarded as the front runner to replace her, but he just doesn't have that same standing. So I think it's going to be very different. New South Wales is the crucial state as far as Scott Morrison is concerned to hold on to at the coming federal election. He's been accused of being the Prime Minister for New South Wales. It's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. But clearly from his comments today, like a lot of other politicians, he was giving her due regard for her role.
I have worked with her extremely closely, and she has always been a vibrant spirit when it comes to our debates, doing the best for the people of New South Wales.
Laura, Gladys Berejiklian is the third New South Wales Liberal Premier to have to stand aside thanks to an ICAC investigation. Is the standard to which New South Wales state politicians held a higher standard than for federal politicians, and why is that?
Well, absolutely, it's a higher standard, and it's a standard that expects and demands integrity from all politicians, as Gladys Berejiklian said herself. The reason why there is a different standard is because we don't have a federal corruption commission. The government in Canberra has resisted this furiously, and continues to do so, despite sort of some mealy-mouthed words to that effect. And I think it was telling today, Lee, that the Prime Minister rushed out to announce a reshuffle today caused by the fact that his former Attorney General, Christian Porter, has been forced to stand aside because he couldn't or wouldn't say where up to $1 million of funding for his legal bills had come from. And he's been replaced by another minister, Angus Taylor, who's had his own questions about ministerial standards to answer, which haven't been answered.
Laura, there was some other political news around today. The Prime Minister's racing to open Australia's international borders. How will that work?
Well, I think this is one of the interesting dynamics that plays into the whole question of Gladys Berejiklian's departure as well, Lee, and that question of national cabinet interactions. The Prime Minister is sort of wresting control back from the premiers at the moment on the way we deal with coming out of the lockdown by announcing that international borders will open next month, and by also cutting off those emergency payments earlier in the week. He's basically forcing the states to come out of lockdown, whether they like it or not. So that's going to be the really interesting dynamic, because there are big risks in doing that for the capabilities of our health system and for the financial position of a lot of people who've been relying on those payments. So a really interesting dynamic, but offering that hope of people being able to get together at Christmas.
Laura Tingle, thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
As I mentioned earlier, 7:30's Paul Farrell has been leading the pack on the Berejiklian investigation. Paul, the hearings are due to start on the 18th of October. What can we expect then?
Well, I think the main thing that we can expect is that it's very likely the Premier herself will be called to give evidence and for the first time have to explain her actions in a detailed and thorough way in relation to the administration of these grants, in relation to her role in them, and in relation to the representations that Daryl Maguire made to her. But in addition to that, there were a number of other senior ministers present at crucial points of the decision-making around this grant, and so it's entirely possible they could be called to give evidence as well. So what we could end up seeing is a kind of all-star cast public ICAC hearing with some of the most senior members of the New South Wales government giving evidence.
And then what do we know about the time frame, how long it's likely to take, when we might actually know what the outcome of the inquiry is and so on?
Yeah, it's very hard to know exactly what the timings will be, but and ICAC's already taken a year to get this far to the investigation. But certainly it's possible that in coming months we could find ourselves in a position where ICAC is ready to make findings against particular people. But it could take months, it could take another year, so we'll all have to wait and see. But certainly these public hearings in coming weeks are going to be an extraordinary series of events.
I'm sure you'll be down there to keep an eye on them. Paul Farrell, thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
That's the program for tonight. Thanks for your company. Good night.